Episode 584. Have Song, Will Travel. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am recording this episode earlier in the week than usual because Justin's traveling. Wild and crazy man. And I didn't want to screw that up for him. So I will not know about anything that happens later in this week. This podcast is still going to come out on Friday, March 25th, 2022. So I apologize if I missed something momentous or important or particularly interesting. That's just the way time works. And the other thing that means is I haven't had any time to collect anything interesting for all y'all. So I'm just going to plow right into Twain this week. And this week's chapter, chapter 3, really is a very Twainy kind of chapter. So if you're not a fan of the very Twainy Twainness, when Twain really gets into the humor groove that is very, very much of his time as well as of his style, then hold your nose and listen because there's some important characterization stuff that's going on in the chapter. Or skip to the end and see if you can pick it up through post-chapter conversation. Either way, Twain does some interesting things in the chapter. First, I want to remind you the word pathetic doesn't mean sad, sorry, what a sorry case you are, but pathetic as in pathétique or pathos. It's emotion, it's feeling, it's soulful feeling is the way Twain uses it. One of the things that makes today's chapter so particularly Twain-y, in my point of view, you may disagree, is Twain loves popping heads that are full of hot air. You know, he loves taking down big, pompous fools. It is one of the things that he does over and over again in all of the writing I've read that he's done, which isn't everything, but it's a stretch. And this is one of those chapters where he has picked somebody in town. It's always an adult, and the adult is shown up by the kids. Now, last week's chapter with the priest, that was different. The priest was not pompous and egotistical and showing off in front of everybody, and especially in front of children. The priest made a specific kind of error in his read of what kind of thing would motivate Joan. And Louis de Camp, our narrator, pointed that out to us. And that was both characterization and some foreshadowing. This week's chapter, there is also a little bit of both characterization and foreshadowing, but he's going to do it differently. A character who doesn't matter as much as the priest gets taken down a notch or 3. And that's fine. That is absolutely a Twain prerogative. And I don't mean to say that I don't think humorous things like this never happened in France. It's just that the way Twain does it sounds an awful lot like Midwest 1890s or even West 1890s, which rural France was not. They're kind of separated by a language plus. Along with the 100 Years' War and the Pope Wars and all of those things that had happened that came to bear on the characters who we see in this book, another thing that comes to bear is remembering things like, well, what are the national stories that people told each other and told themselves? What are kind of the epic truths that had been passed down, that had, in the words of Lord of the Rings, history has become legend and legend has become myth. And one of those stories in France was Charlemagne. The stories of Charlemagne. Charlemagne was, for all intents and purposes, and this is really simplifying everything, France's King Arthur is Charlemagne. And the Knights of the Round Table in France were the paladins. There were 12 paladins who were, the noblest knights. They were all the Lancelots. They were noble, they were true, they were honest, they were the embodiment of chivalry, they were fighting good fights and doing good deeds and all of that. Which is also where the name for the late 50s, early 60s TV Western and radio Western, it transitioned from TV to radio, which is one of the few, if not the only one, that successfully did that, I think. Anyway, there was a show called Have Gun, Will Travel, which evidently started as a joke with Bob Hope, Have Tux, Will Travel. It becomes Have Gun, Will Travel, and thus we have Song, Will Travel, because today the song that we're dealing with is the Song of Roland. Roland was, well, by the time it gets to being written down as a song, Roland had become the nephew of Charlemagne. In the beginning, Roland was probably a paladin, may have just been a dude who was fighting. Kind of hard to tell because the whole real story took place in like 778 AD or Common Era CE. It's a long time ago. And it was a long time between the thing that probably happened and a whole long stretch of oral tradition there in the middle, and then the written down part. If you want to study more about it, it is fascinating. Dorothy Sayers did do a translation of it, which was very well received. Dorothy Sayers of the Peter Wimsey novel family of books. It's not just a series, there's a whole mess load of stuff. But that Dorothy Sayers was also an excellent translator. I know she did The Song of Roland. I know she did Divine Comedy. She did Dante's Inferno. I know she did more than that. Those are the two that are coming to mind. Either way, Sayers is the one who really clarified for me that you have a choice when you're translating. You can translate for rhythm, you can translate for rhyme, or you can translate for meaning. You can, if you're good, get two of those three, but rarely will you ever be able to touch all three in your translation. So you kind of have to make a decision which way you're going to go. That's why Dante's Inferno is so hard to translate. The way the cantos are written is in terza rima. That's 3-line rhyme with three. It's just insane. Song of Roland is kind of like that, actually. It has a very specific rhythmic structure and a very specific rhyming structure. And I'm not going to get into it here because yikes, but just know that if you're reading it in English, whatever version of it you read is going to be missing a whole layer of something. Either the rhythm is going to be missing or the rhyme is going to be missing. And sometimes some of the meaning is probably going to be missed as well. Some of the resonances. And Twain is trying very hard at the end of today's chapter to find a way to communicate some of that to a specifically American audience. He can't do it by pointing out or touching back on anything that would have been particularly familiar to the audience that he was writing for at the time, the late 1800s, because Louis de Camp wasn't alive then. He was already dead. And so you can kind of feel Twain touching out at things in the dark, trying to find something that he can use to communicate what he's trying to communicate at the end of the chapter. I don't know that he achieves it ever. And so that's why we're talking a little bit about the Song of Roland now. Twain's title for this chapter is All Aflame with Love of France. And that becomes him leaning on the Song of Roland at the end of today's chapter. As I mentioned before, Roland, by the time it becomes the epic poem that gets written down, is one of Charlemagne's knights. He's good, he's true, he's all of the cool, awesome stuff. And yet he makes a mistake. He is bringing up the rear. He is betrayed by treachery. In some versions, it's his stepfather who betrays him. In some versions, Roland kind of set himself up for that by volunteering his stepfather for a very dangerous task. And the stepfather's like, well, I'm going to get you back. This is, of course, all set against fights in Spain with the Saracens. The Saracens being Muslim leaders who, wow, the history of this part of the world gets so complicated. I'm not even going to sort of get this right. But there was the Muslim movement into Spain. That's where you get the really cool Moorish architecture that you even see in some of southern Italy as well. There's a whole mess load of fighting that happens There's a fundamental misunderstanding of Islam in Song of Roland. At one point, they have the Saracens praying to the god Apollo. They're praying to Muhammad as though Muhammad was a god, which we know is not the truth. There's just a whole messload of things, but some of that wasn't so much a fundamental misunderstanding as it was a fundamental twisting of what they knew in order to try and create this duality. You have Charlemagne and his dudes, totally good, holy good, Wholly and Holly. That means, if we're dealing in a dualistic framework, that the Saracens are going to be evil. Well, if you're going to have a perfect mirror image of a Christian good, which would include the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, then you are going to need to have a matching, mirrored evil. There are three gods that the Islamic Saracens are supposed to be praying to, Apollo being one, Muhammad being the other. And I honestly can't remember who the third one was. Kind of doesn't matter because it's apocryphal. But that's where that comes from, is you're seeing the myth part of the legend part of what had been a real historical route, where Roland is bringing up the rear of Charlemagne's troops, realizes they are going to be attacked from the rear. He has a horn, Oliphant. He knows he can blow this horn and use that horn to get Charlemagne's attention, to rally the troops, to bring them back to save Roland and his little band that's bringing up the rear. And he doesn't, because he thinks that that's going to be a coward's way out, and that he and his strong fighting folk are totally capable of handling the situation. Realizes not too far on that he's made a horrible miscalculation and blows that horn like there's no tomorrow, which is funny because there kind of isn't one for him. He actually blows the horn so hard that he bursts blood vessels in his head and kills himself. Everybody else is dead too, although they're dead because Saracens were fighting them. There's also another theme going on here where there's some fancy footwork going on where Roland hides his sword so that it doesn't get captured by the enemy, because the sword is a famous sword. It's kind of an Excalibur type sword. So anyway, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the Song of Roland. The important things to know: he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to be chivalrous. He fails, but he fails in a good way. He fails by trying to be and do right. And in the end, he lifts his hand, his gauntlet, his right hand, his sword hand, with the protective armor on it, kind of like the glove in Marvel movies. Anyway, there are no snaps in the Song of Roland. He raises his hand to heaven. The angel Gabriel sees this, comes down, blesses him, and takes him. And then it goes on, because that may be the climax, but that's not the end. And more chaos and denouement, tying up all the loose ends, ensues. We will talk about why Twain was really smart for using the Song of Roland in this part after you've listened to the chapter. So now we're going to play you Chapter 3 of Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Volume 1, Chapter 3, All Aflame with Love of France. Speaking of this matter reminds me of many incidents, many things that I could tell, but I think I will not try to do it now. It will be more to my present humor to call back a little glimpse of the simple and colorless good times we used to have in our village homes in those peaceful days, especially in the winter. In the summer we children were out on the breezy uplands with the flocks from dawn till night, and then there was noisy frolicking and all that. But winter was the cozy time, winter was the snug time. Often we gathered in old Jacques d'Arc's big dirt-floored apartment, with a great fire going, and played games, and sang songs, and told fortunes, and listened to the old villagers tell tales and histories and lies and one thing and another till 12 o'clock at night. One winter's night we were gathered there. It was the winter that for years afterward they called the hard winter, and that particular night was a sharp one. It blew a gale outside, and the screaming of the wind was a stirring sound, and I think I may say it was beautiful, for I think it is great and fine and beautiful to hear the wind rage and storm and blow its clarions like that when you are inside and comfortable. And we were. We had a roaring fire, and the pleasant spit-spit of the snow and sleet falling in it down the chimney, and the yarning and laughing and singing went on at a noble rate till about 10 o'clock, and then we had a supper of hot porridge and beans, and meal cakes with butter, and appetites to match. Little Joan sat on a box apart, and had her bowl and bread on another one, and her pets around her helping. She had more than was usual of them or economical, because all the outcast cats came and took up with her, and homeless or unlovable animals of other kinds heard about it and came, and these spread the matter to the other creatures, and they came also. And as the birds and the other timid wild things of the woods were not afraid of her, but always had an idea she was a friend when they came across her, and generally struck up an acquaintance with her to get invited to the house, she always had samples of those breeds in stock. She was hospitable to them all, for an animal was an animal to her, and dear by mere reason of being an animal, no matter about its sort or social station. And as she would allow of no cages, no collars, no fetters, but left the creatures free to come and go as they liked, that contented them, and they came. And they didn't go, to any extent. And so they were a marvelous nuisance, and made Jacques d'Arc swear a good deal, but his wife said God gave the child the instinct, and knew what he was doing when he did it. Therefore it must have its course. It would be no sound prudence to meddle with his affairs when no invitation had been extended. So the pets were left in peace, and here they were, as I have said, rabbits, birds, squirrels, cats, and other reptiles, all around the child, and full of interest in her supper, and helping what they could. There was a very small squirrel on her shoulder, sitting up, as those creatures do, and turning a rocky fragrant of prehistoric chestnut cake over and over in its knotty hands, and hunting for the less indurated places, and giving its elevated bushy tail a flirt and its pointed ears a toss when it found one, signifying thankfulness and surprise. And then it filed that place off with those two slender front teeth which a squirrel carries for that purpose and not for ornament, for ornamental they never could be, as any will admit that have noticed them. Everything was going fine and breezy and hilarious, but then there came an interruption, for somebody hammered on the door. It was one of those ragged road stragglers. The eternal wars kept the country full of them. He came in, all over snow, and stamped his feet, and shook, and brushed himself, and shut the door, and took off his limp ruin of a hat, and slapped it once or twice against his leg to knock off its fleece of snow, and then glanced around on the company with a pleased look upon his thin face, and a most yearning and famished one in his eye when it fell upon the victuals. And then he gave us a humble and conciliatory salutation, and said it was a blessed thing to have a fire like that on such a night, and a roof overhead like this, and that rich food to eat, and loving friends to talk with. Ah, yes, this was true, and God help the homeless, and such as must trudge the roads in this weather. Nobody said anything. The embarrassed poor creature stood there and appealed to one face after the other with his eyes, and found no welcome in any, the smile on his own face flickering and fading and perishing meanwhile. Then he dropped his gaze, the muscles of his face began to twitch, and he put up his hand to cover this womanish sign of weakness. "Sit down!" This thunderblast was from old Jacques d'Arc, and Joan was the object of it. The stranger was startled and took his hand away, and there was Joan standing before him offering her bowl of porridge. The man said, "God Almighty bless you, my darling!" And then the tears came and ran down his cheeks, but he was afraid to take the bowl. Do you hear me? Sit down, I say." There could not be a child more easy to persuade than Joan, but this was not the way. Her father had not the art, neither could he learn it. Joan said, "Father, he is hungry, I can see it." "Let him work for food, then. We are being eaten out of house and home by his like, and I have said I would endure it no more, and will keep my word. He has the face of a rascal anyhow, and a villain. Sit down, I tell you." "I know not if he is a rascal or no, but he is hungry, father, and shall have my porridge. I do not need it." "If you don't obey me, I'll— Rascals are not entitled to help from honest people, and no bite nor sup shall they have in this house. Joan!" She set her bowl down on the box and came over and stood before her scowling father and said, "Father, if you will not let me, then it must be as you say. But I would that you would think. Then you would see that it is not right to punish one part of him for what the other part has done, for it is that poor stranger's head that does the evil things, but it is not his head that is hungry, it is his stomach, and it has done no harm to anybody, but is without blame and innocent, not having any way to do a wrong, even if it was minded to it. Please let—" "What an idea! It is the most idiotic speech I ever heard." But Aubrey the mayor broke in, he being fond of an argument and having a pretty gift in that regard, as all acknowledged. Rising in his place and leaning his knuckles upon the table and looking about him with easy dignity, after the manner of such as be orators, he began, smooth and persuasive, "I will differ with you there, gossip, and will undertake to show the company," here he looked around upon us and nodded his head in a confident way, "that there is a grain of sense in what the child has said. For, look you, it is of a certainty most true and demonstrable that it is a man's head that is master and supreme ruler over his whole body. Is that granted? Will any deny it?" He glanced around again. Everybody indicated assent. "Very well, then. That being the case, no part of the body is responsible for the result when it carries out an order delivered to it by the head. Ergo, the head is alone responsible for crimes done by a man's hands or feet or stomach. Do you get the idea? Am I right thus far?" Everybody said yes, and said it with enthusiasm, and some said, one to another, that the mayor was in great form tonight and at his very best, which pleased the mayor exceedingly and made his eyes sparkle with pleasure, for he overheard these things. So he went on in the same fertile and brilliant way. "Now, then, we will consider what the term responsibility means, and how it affects the case in point. Responsibility makes a man responsible for only those things for which he is properly responsible." And he waved his spoon around in a wide sweep to indicate the comprehensive nature of that class of responsibilities which render people responsible, and several exclaimed admiringly, "He is right. He has put that whole tangled thing into a nutshell. It is wonderful." After a little pause, to give the interest opportunity to gather and grow, he went on. "Very good. Let us suppose the case of a pair of tongs that falls upon a man's foot, causing a cruel hurt. Will you claim that the tongs are punishable for that? The question is answered. I see by your faces that you would call such a claim absurd. Now, why is it absurd? It is absurd because there being no reasoning faculty, that is to say, no faculty of personal command, in a pair of tongs, personal responsibility for the acts of the tongs is wholly absent from the tongs, and therefore, responsibility being absent, punishment cannot ensue. Am I right?" A hearty burst of applause was his answer. "Now then, we arrive at a man's stomach. Consider how exactly, how marvelously, indeed, its situation corresponds to that of a pair of tongs. Listen, and take careful note, I beg you. Can a man's stomach plan a murder? No. Can it plan a theft? No. Can it plan an incendiary fire? No. Now answer me, can a pair of tongs?" There were admiring shouts of "No!" and "The cases are just exact!" and "Don't he do it splendid!" Now then, friends and neighbors, a stomach which cannot plan a crime cannot be a principal in the commission of it. That is plain, as you see. The matter is narrowed down by that much. We will narrow it further. Can a stomach, of its own motion, assist at a crime? The answer is no, because command is absent, the reasoning faculty is absent, volition is absent, as in the case of the tongs. We perceive now, do we not, that the stomach is totally irresponsible for crimes committed, either in whole or in part, by it? He got a rousing cheer for response. Then what do we arrive at as our verdict? Clearly this, that there is no such thing in this world as a guilty stomach, that in the body of the veriest rascal resides a pure and innocent stomach, that whatever its owner may do, it at least should be sacred in our eyes, and that while God gives us minds to think just and charitable and honorable thoughts, it should be and is our privilege, as well as our duty, not only to feed the hungry stomach that resides in a rascal, having pity for its sorrow and its need, but to do it gladly, gratefully, in recognition of its sturdy and loyal maintenance of its purity and innocence in the midst of temptation and in company so repugnant to its better feelings. I am done. Well, you never saw such an effect. They rose, the whole house rose, and clapped, and cheered, and praised him to the skies, and one after another, still clapping and shouting, they crowded forward, some with moisture in their eyes, and wrung his hands, and said such glorious things to him that he was clear overcome with pride and happiness, and couldn't say a word, for his voice would have broken sure. It was splendid to see, and everybody said he had never come up to that speech in his life before, and never could do it again. Eloquence is a power, there is no question of that. Even old Jacques d'Art was carried away, for once in his life, and shouted out, "It's all right, Joan! Give him the porridge!" She was embarrassed, and did not seem to know what to say, and so didn't say anything. It was because she had given the man the porridge long ago, and he had already eaten it all up. When she was asked why she had not waited until a decision was arrived at, she said the man's stomach was very hungry, and it would not have been wise to wait, since she could not tell what the decision would be. Now that was a good and thoughtful idea for a child. The man was not a rascal at all, he was a very good fellow, only he was out of luck, and surely that was no crime at that time in France. Now that his stomach was proved to be innocent, it was allowed to make itself at home, and as soon as it was all filled and needed nothing more, the man unwound his tongue and turned it loose, and it was really a noble one to go. He had been in the wars for years, and the things he told and the way he told them fired everybody's patriotism away up high, and set all hearts to thumping and all pulses to leaping. Then, before anybody rightly knew how the change was made, he was leading us a sublime march through the ancient glories of France, and in fancy we saw the titanic forms of the 12 paladins rise out of the mists of the past and face their fate. We heard the tread of the innumerable hosts sweeping down to shut them in. We saw this human tide flow and ebb, ebb and flow, and waste away before that little band of heroes. We saw each detail pass before us of that most stupendous, most disastrous, yet most adored and glorious day in French legendary history. Here and there and yonder across that vast field of the dead and dying, we saw this and that and the other paladin dealing his prodigious blows with weary arm and failing strength, and one by one we saw them fall, till only one remained, he that was without peer, he whose name gives name to the Song of Songs, the song which no Frenchman can hear and keep his feelings down and his pride of country cool. Then, grandest and pitifullest scene of all, we saw his own pathetic death, and our stillness, as we sat with parted lips and breathless, hanging upon this man's words, gave us a sense of the awful stillness that reigned in that field of slaughter when that last surviving soul had passed. And now, in this solemn hush, the stranger gave Joan a pat or two on the head and said, "Little maid, whom God keep, you have brought me from death to life this night. Now listen, Here is your reward." And at that supreme time, for such a heart-melting, soul-rousing surprise, without another word he lifted up the most noble and pathetic voice that was ever heard, and began to pour out the great song of Roland. Think of that! With a French audience all stirred up and ready. Oh, where was your spoken eloquence now? What was it to this? How fine he looked, how stately, how inspired, as he stood there with that mighty chant welling from his lips and his heart, his whole body transfigured, and his rags along with it. Everybody rose and stood while he sang, and their faces glowed, and their eyes burned, and the tears came and flowed down their cheeks, and their forms began to sway unconsciously to the swing of the song, and their bosoms to heave and pant, and moanings broke out, and deep ejaculations, and when the last verse was reached, and Roland lay dying, all alone, with his face to the field and to his slain, lying there in heaps and winrows, and took off and held up his gauntlet to God with his failing hand, and breathed his beautiful prayer with his paling pips, all burst out in sobs and wailings. But when the final great note died out, and the song was done, they all flung themselves in a body at the singer, stark mad with love of him, and love of France, and pride in her great deeds and old renown, and smothered him with their embracings. But Joan was there first, hugged close to his breast, and covering his face with idolatrous kisses. The storm raged on outside, but that was no matter. This was the stranger's home now, for as long as he might please. End of chapter 3.
All right, then. So we ended this chapter in the Song of Roland, but I want to back up a little bit to deal with Joan before we deal with Roland. First, I wondered if you felt like I did that Twain was setting Joan up to be Snow White, and then realized, there was no Disney film when Twain wrote this, which isn't to say that there weren't going to be other fables and stories and things with young girls who had lots of woodland creatures come and perch on her and love her because she is innocent and good and sweet and kind and gives them food. My sister was one of those people as a child. But yeah, it totally rang Disney-era Snow White bells to me, which seemed a little bit too much on the nose to me at the time, and then I kind of smacked myself around and said, no, it makes sense that Twain would have drawn on that visual, that kind of iconography for what Joan is like. Here, let me show you. And then we get Joan performing her feats of logic the same way that she did in the previous chapter with the priest, this time with her father. And speaking back to your father at all, even in Twain's day, would have been kind of a surprise. It seems to me that people have learned to listen to Joan, that she's never speaking in anger, but she is also rarely being stupid. And I loved her argument that, is it right to punish one part of him for the other parts done? His stomach isn't at fault. If he's done something wrong, it wasn't his stomach that did it. That was really fabulous kid logic. I loved that. All right then, young lady, here, feed whoever. And then Aubrey, the mayor, the husband of the woman who got the fairies banished, and the father of one of Joan's friends. And again, Aubrey was a real guy, but I doubt he was this guy. Aubrey goes on and pontificates. It's for 2 full pages. And he does give a, I think, beautiful example of begging the question for realsies. Because begging the question is circular logic. It's where one question begs the next question, which begs the next question, which brings you back to the first question. And so he says, responsibility makes a man responsible for only those things for which he's properly responsible. I think that is actually and in fact a real example of begging the question instead of the ridiculous misusage of that phrase that we hear all the time. So yay, we finally found one. And then of course, it's just awesome that everybody thinks the mayor's a genius. They've completely forgotten Joan, which is fine with Joan. I also do love that the guy ended his speechifying with, I am done. Well, thank you for letting us know. All of that, I firmly believe all of that is there as filler for Twain to get out of needing to have Joan have an actual argument with her father. Because if the mayor hadn't picked up and started yammering when he did, Joan's father would have responded to her, and Twain would have had to work himself out of that. And that would have been much harder for Joan to countermand a direct order after she's made her case. By doing this, Twain clears the deck for Joan. Joan now takes that time to just hand the poor guy the porridge and get on with it because she didn't know how things were going to pan out, and he was still hungry. She's practical, this child, practical and smart. So, why the Song of Roland? First off, it's been a major work of epic poetry in France for 1,000 years, almost. It's been oral tradition for it longer than 1,000 years. It's been written down for almost 1,000 years. And it's one of the few bits of original, like it translated from oral tradition into written poetry. And we have all of it. We didn't lose any of that original written version. So it's unique in several different ways, for both for its age and for the fact that it's entire. But when we're looking at Joan characterization, we have what we've learned about her and her father. She's willing to stand up to her father. And her heart, she is more than happy to feed the birds and the humans when they need it, and feed them from her own bowl, which is also important. But the Song of Roland parallels Joan in a foreshadowy kind of way as well. If the Song of Roland has been set up in order to have the mirrored good versus evil battle, and Roland is on the side of the good, on the side of Charlemagne, the paladins, the Trinity, and all of that, then he's at the end, when he lifts his hand to heaven, he lifts his hand towards his Lord, both Charlemagne, who he is serving, and God, who he is serving. And he is ultimately rewarded for being a good servant. So he serves his Lord. In his case, there's the two, there's Charlemagne and God. He sacrifices for his Lord in trying to win things for his Lord. And he doesn't show weakness by calling for help too early, by not expecting somebody to come in and save him. You can already see where the parallels are, right? Between what you already know about the Joan of Arc story and what we just said about Roland. So it's not an accident that Twain put it in here. He's using what he's got as tools very well, I think. It is still a very Twainy chapter, and some of it is being played for laughs. But as we said before, being silly doesn't mean you aren't very, very serious about your topic. And Twain is definitely in that camp, especially in this book. And on that note, I think I'm out of here. I'm going to let Justin get to work on the audio, and I'm going to get back to work and end my lunch hour. And you all have a great rest of your week. I will talk to you soon. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Be well. I'll talk to you later. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.